Hey, welcome everybody from the break. This is Tom, of course, your host for today's virtual conference. Up next, we have Amy Yee, and she's going to be talking about the Zero Trust Roadmap, from cyber villains to zero trust, layers, building resilience step by step. I'm excited for this one because I love it when we can actually teach folks kind of doing stuff, whether it's step by step or just here's a bunch of information. I like it when we actually learn stuff. So our presenter is here taking questions as well. I'm going to try to stump her with questions of my own at the end. But as we go through the presentation, throw some stuff in the chat and the Q&A. We'd love to hear from you guys out there, even if it's maybe some anecdotal stuff that you guys are running into as we look at the Zero Trust framework today. So that being said, it's wonderful to have you here, Amy. The floor is yours. Take it away.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Tom. And I love that about, learning from the audience. I always say that 50% of the real content is with the audience. So I do hope that we can hear some stuff from the audience and I can take a break and relax. I'm not the ultimate authority on everything zero trust and critical infrastructure, and I am here to learn. So thank you for having me. Good day, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. The title of this session is Zero Trust Roadmap for Critical Infrastructure. But really, of course, what we're here to talk about is the reality that the systems that we all rely on every day, power, water, transportation, healthcare, are now squarely in the crosshairs of cyber adversaries. I know many of you in this room live that reality. Some of you are in IT, some in OT, some in risk and compliance, some in operations, and some of you might just be here to learn more about this problem. And so I wanted to ensure that this presentation was accessible to you as well. You all bring different perspectives, and they're all very important to have, but you all share responsibility as well for helping to keep critical services safe and reliable. And that means that you know how hard it is. Siloed teams, legacy technology, and attackers who don't respect our boundaries. So what I want to do today is two things. And first of all, I want to frame the challenge that we're facing in a way that connects across those silos to show why we can't afford to look at the problem in only one sector or in one department at a time. And second, I wanted to walk through some practical steps that takes all of the guidance and makes it something that is more actionable in terms of a zero trust roadmap, kind of step by step, that you can take back to your organizations, and something that is accessible and understandable. Not as a silver bullet, but as a way to sequence the action and prioritize what matters and build resilience against the kinds of adversaries that we're all dealing with. It affects us all. Zero trust isn't new. I wanted to make sure I said that at the beginning. I know it's not new, and we've been talking about it for years. But what is new is the urgency that we're all feeling in critical infrastructure. The attacks are louder, more global, and more cross-sector than ever before. We're facing real villains, and that's hence the villain in the top corner of the slide. State actors, ransomware crews, and opportunists who see our weakest links. But the point isn't to scare you, it's to look at how zero trust gives us a playbook. And again, not a silver bullet, but a clear sequence of things that we can look at for a situation where we know that the threats are already inside the walls. Next slide. So who am I? My name is Amy Yee, as Tom said. And I started off as an engineer. And so this has a lot of relevance for me because I started off, working with PLCs, programmable logic controllers, and I didn't think they were all that interesting at the time, to be honest. But it's been really fun for me to take a journey that took me to consulting. It took me through startups and investment. It took me to being an executive in healthcare, having oversight of cyber as well as software engineering and digital projects, software platforms, moving to the cloud, all kinds of things, everything that had to do with technology, essentially, for the last 8 years. And now I wear 3 hats. I founded my own podcast called Wired for Change. And with that, I really look at empowering everybody who is dealing with change, from change leaders to the change makers who are trying to drive change within their organizations and within society as a whole. And that means that touches cybersecurity, it touches compliance, it touches leadership, and it touches how teams work together. It touches product innovation, so many different things. I hope you'll take a minute to check it out at some point. I also wear a hat at a cybersecurity company called C3SA, and you can read the description there. C3SA has been rooted in critical infrastructure and national security security for over 20 years now, and they do a lot of work in this area. I'm there as their Chief Digital Transformation Officer, working with clients as well as working on our internal growth and building our ecosystem. Thirdly, I'm with a group called Relevantz. Relevantz is a company that helps build software engineering products. And so with that, I touch a lot of other sectors as well, including finance and healthcare and government and other software products and some of the largest software development products companies in the world. Okay, so that's a little bit about me. And again, it's that technical bit of me that gets me excited about PLCs, I guess, and the part of me that looks at the governance and putting in place the systems that are needed in order to facilitate the work that needs to be done. So what is critical infrastructure? I'm going to start with the 50,000-foot view. This is the first challenge. Every country defines critical infrastructure differently. In the US, there are 16 sectors. In Canada, it's 10. In Australia, it's different. And in Europe, it's different again. Why is that important? With those definitions come different degrees of protection, regulation, and oversight. So in some countries, being labeled critical infrastructure means mandatory reporting, compliance with strict security standards, and government partnership. In others, the same type of system may sit outside of those protections entirely, and the result is a patchwork. One country's critical infrastructure might be another country's blind spot. So if I look at the next slide, I can see I've laid out kind of the profiles of some of these critical infrastructure definitions, by country. And so although they may vary across countries, these sectors are vital, of course, because their incapacitation or destruction would have a debilitating effect on a nation's security, economic security, public health, and/or safety, which can pose a physical threat to human lives, as we know. So each country has different strengths and weaknesses. So if I looked at the US, based on some information that I've gathered, although a fully matured systematic approach has not yet been achieved, ongoing initiatives and lessons are gradually strengthening the Homeland Security enterprise's capacity to manage emerging critical risks. As we know, the U.S. involves federal, state, local, and private sector partners, with Department of Homeland Security and its components taking on proactive steps to address emerging critical risks. But there's no unified kind of robust process or no one, guide, thou shalt do this, that is holistically identifying and allowing people to assess or systematically correct or connect findings to strategic planning, policy, and budgeting. In Korea, although we certainly, spend a lot of time looking at U.S. resources because of how advanced, relatively they are. In Korea, we know that there's significant progress in terms of a structured, data-driven approach for identifying and analyzing emerging critical risks, as well as risk governance structures and application of big data analytics, scenario planning, and horizon scanning. But they need more in terms of recommendation prioritization and comprehensive assessments of management maturity and better linkages between exercises and then the foresight-based analysis, which could strengthen their resilience against evolving complex risk. Now, why does that matter? Adversaries don't respect those definitions. They don't say, well, that's outside the US's list of 16 critical sectors, so we'll leave it alone. They look for weak points wherever they can find them, interconnections. And throughout this presentation, we'll look at, what sort of blanket areas can impact everything, and then what is, something that is a way of engaging other sectors or looking at scenarios that help to demonstrate those impacts. A good example of this is the CISA ransomware attack in 2021. CISA itself wasn't categorized as critical infrastructure, but when its remote management software was compromised, the impact cascaded into hospitals, schools, and local governments, entities that were defined as critical in some countries. So this shows us that you can't afford to take a siloed view again. And not to, I don't want anyone to feel helpless about this because, well, what's the point of doing something? You still need to take a wide perspective or take the time to take a wide perspective where you can. So it's a lot of zooming in and then zooming out again, assuming that if it's essential to your mission or to society, it's a potential target, whether or not a government list says so. So again, this is why I think it's so important to have these conversations and to make these conversations more accessible to folks who are maybe not just working in critical infrastructure, but also up and broadly out. Okay. So if I look at a list of critical infrastructure kind of threats, you can see that, they're a global problem as well. So we've looked at it, by country, but we also know that it's connected and it's everywhere. So over the last 5 years even, and I'm not saying that this is a completely comprehensive list, but it is a list, the threat picture has escalated dramatically. In 2020, we saw Russian espionage through the SolarWinds supply chain compromise and Iranian attempts to poison water supplies in Israel. And then if you look at the list a year later, Colonial Pipeline showed the world how ransomware against one operator could disrupt transportation, aviation, and the economy in days. And then since then, campaigns have only grown, more global and more cross-sector. The cyber Avengers linked to Iran hit water utilities, oil and gas, and industrial systems across 3 continents. Typhoon, backed by China, quietly infiltrated communications, energy, transportation, and water in the US and Guam, pre-positioning for future disruption. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few more slides. Typhoon focused on espionage, exfiltrating data from telecoms and even the US National Guard. And in 2025, Russian actors exploited Cisco iOS flaws to gain access across critical networks worldwide. And that's something that is still evolving as this presentation is being delivered. The pattern is clear, though. It's not a localized problem. It's global, it's cross-sector, and it's growing. Attacks on water ripple into healthcare. Attacks on pipelines ripple into transportation, energy, emergency services. The scope of what's possible is far wider than how any single government defines critical infrastructure. And that's part of the challenge. It's not anyone's fault that we don't have the same definition or, a precise definition. It's important to land on some definition and then build that visibility so that you can manage it. So here's the real question. How do we operate in a world where the threats are already inside the walls, moving across the very boundaries we've relied on to define and regulate protection? Some of the key challenges on this slide in terms of how do we operate in this world, as I had asked earlier. So let's look at the view from the critical infrastructure position. So we've looked at sort of that 50,000 foot view, and then now if we look at critical infrastructure as a system, we look at some of these key challenges, and it's not exhaustive. But without robust detection and response insights, we know that the preventative controls are limited and atrophy over time. So security teams and executives often believe their security is better than it is due to this atrophy. Things just continue to change, and it's hard to keep up with how those changes impact the systems. And then there's sprawl that tends to grow. When we think about protecting critical infrastructure, it's not enough to look at the threat landscape in isolation. We also have to acknowledge the systemic changes that make defending critical infrastructure so difficult. These aren't just technical gaps, they're structural issues, visibility, legacy protocols, different risk models for IT versus OT. So you can't just apply, IT to OT because there are different priorities they have in mind. Frameworks that emphasize prevention over resilience and the difficulty of knowing what to prioritize, a challenge across, many sectors, but particularly here. And again, if we only look at these challenges through a narrow lens, like sector by sector, IT separate from OT, we miss the interconnections. An outdated protocol in one sector can open the door to disruption across many others. And a prevention-heavy framework that works in IT might not work in OT, where continuity and safety come first. So part of the Zero Trust roadmap isn't just about technology. It's about shifting mindset to see those challenges as interconnected and systemic, not siloed. And so when we talk about protecting critical infrastructure, it's not just the threats themselves, although we do need to look at them and consider them. It's the underlying challenges that make defending these systems so complex. So let me walk you through some of these very briefly. So the first one, lack of OT asset visibility. And this won't be a surprise for anyone who is working in critical infrastructure, but most sectors don't have full OT asset inventory. And they don't know everything they have running in their environments. They don't know all reports necessarily. And things change sometimes over time. Systems accumulate over decades across facilities, and the result is sprawl. You can't protect what you don't even know exists. And you need to take the time to do that. And that time isn't always there. Secondly, legacy protocols. So industrial systems often still run on older protocols like Modbus or IEC 60870-5-104, which were designed for reliability, or shortened to IEC 104, not for a connected adversarial world. They inherently trust every command, which makes them especially vulnerable when exposed to modern threat actors, because they were built for a different reason, for a different world. Number three, IT is not the same as OT, as I'd mentioned. In IT, the priorities are confidentiality, integrity, availability. You manage the business. In OT, the priorities are generally safety, reliability, and physical process continuity. And that's why you are a business. That means the risks are different, and frameworks built for IT don't always map cleanly to OT environments. Even the idea of pen testing. You don't really pen test OT environments like you do IT environments, because of that safety and criticality. Fourth, prevention bias. Most well-known security frameworks lean heavily towards prevention, endpoint protection, hardening, patching, access controls. All important, but in OT environments, prevention is never perfect. You also need the ability to detect, respond, and continue operating safely while under attack. You need to, keep the water going or the power going while you're under attack, and that's where a lot of organizations struggle. And then finally, unclear priorities. Even when organizations recognize these challenges, it's difficult to know where to start. What do you prioritize first? How do you operationalize zero trust across IT and OT, across vendors and contractors, across facilities, when there might not be a one-size-fits-all? Without clear sequencing, teams can feel stuck. And so these are some of the kinds of systemic issues that make protecting critical infrastructure so difficult. And if we only look at them as silos, again, one sector at a time or one piece at a time, then we miss out on some of the challenges that will matter more than any individual challenge. I'm going to have a quick look at critical infrastructure protocols. We've got, and for anyone who is joining us from more of a business standpoint, what are protocols? They're the magic words in industrial control systems, languages that machines use to talk to one another. If an attacker can issue commands on these languages, they can flip breakers, they can overfill tanks, they can disable safety systems, they can change the toxicity of water levels, which makes them kind of magical in a scary way in the wrong hands, right? So we've got some older protocols, on the left, and some of the newer modern protocols on the right. And, while I could talk about, each of these protocols, I don't think I'll take the time to do that, just today. But, if there are older, weaker protocols and there are newer, more modern ones, what's the problem? Like, why doesn't everyone just update? Or why aren't the newer protocols enough, for example? So, the reason for that is the legacy first, security last. Like most of these protocols like Modbus were invented decades ago before cybersecurity was even a concept. And the priority was make machines talk to each other quickly and reliably, not stop hackers. And so the assumption was that these systems lived on isolated networks, so they didn't need security as much. It just wasn't a priority. And so that's why the older protocols are more challenging. They just weren't built for today. And then we've got the fact that there are long equipment lifespans. We all have that really old fridge that just kind of worked forever, or that really old dishwasher that kind of worked forever. Industrial equipment that was built at that time, like PLCs, turbines, transformers, often run 20 to 30 years before replacement. And that means systems built in the 1990s or 2000s are still online today using the same insecure protocols, because you just don't update them the same way as you update software today. You can't just patch a 25-year-old PLC. Sometimes the vendor doesn't even exist anymore. A third thing to think about is just the operational risk of change. So in a factory or a power plant, if you update software and it crashes, then you could cause a production outage or even a safety hazard. So operators tend to follow the rule: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that makes it hard to roll out brand new, more secure protocols. And again, that's just kind of the way it is. It's not through not wanting to or not seeing that there's a need for change. It's just the priority there is to keep things going more than in other sectors. Interoperability demands means that critical infrastructure often has, equipment from many different vendors. And the beauty of simple and secure protocols is that every vendor supports them. So secure replacements exist with encryption, but not everyone implements them the same way, because then you have issues with compatibility. And so that slows adoption. And then there's the cost and scale. So replacing all legacy ICS protocols with secure ones, which would mean, as I hinted in the last item, kind of retrofitting thousands of substations, plants, pipelines, and water facilities. It's possible in theory, but extremely costly and slow in practice. So, the challenge is that also there is a mix of older and newer kind of protocols as well in the same environment. So with all of this, kind of what do we do, right? That's why zero trust strategies for ICS focus so heavily on segmentation, monitoring, and compensating controls. You can't wait for every insecure protocol to disappear. But even if you have newer protocols, it's important to realize, as I've noted at the bottom of this slide, it doesn't mean that you are going to be quote unquote safe. So the example is that in Ukraine in 2016, the crash override malware abused IEC 104. Some utilities looked at that and they thought, well, we use DNP3, so that's not our problem. But it was their problem, and the real operation wasn't about IEC 104, it was about manipulating circuit breakers. So attackers will simply use whatever protocol your systems speak, and different dialects, the same command kind of thing. So then you might ask, well, why bother updating protocols anyways if attackers can just speak the same language and get through every one of them? And the answer is that older protocols are insecure by design. You can think of it that way, and they trust every command, blindly. Modernized protocols will offer a bit of a barrier. They don't eliminate the risk, but they raise the bar. So now an attacker can't just plug in and start issuing commands. Essentially, they need to steal keys or compromise trusted identity, and that buys you detection opportunities, and that's where you can gain an advantage, even if they get a foothold. So that's why we call out the older protocols. Not that using a modern one automatically makes you safe, but to underline the fact that insecure ones widen the attack surface dramatically. But at the end of the day, they will use whatever path we leave open. Okay, so I just wanted to dive a little bit deeper on protocols a little bit, just because it is such a big factor in when you're talking about ICS. So up till now, we've talked about a lot of the challenges, systemic ones. We've talked about challenges that apply, directly to individual plants. And these are the things that make defending critical infrastructure so hard. Interconnected systems, outdated protocols, and we started to hint that zero trust, is needed. So I just wanted to step back a bit and to talk about this a little. I think that in this presentation, we'll talk about them a little bit as layers. So if you're already in critical infrastructure, this isn't going to feel foreign. You already think about security in terms of layers when it comes to physical security. So when you picture a power plant or a water facility, you don't rely on just one fence. You layer security. You have an outer perimeter fence, a gate with badge access, security cameras and guards, locked doors, and then finally restricted access to the control room. Each layer is designed so that even if one fails, the others slow an intruder down and give you a chance to respond. Zero trust applies the same principle in the digital space. It's about putting multiple layers of defense around our assets, identities, devices, and data, and not assuming trust at any single point. So on the next slide, I've mapped, some of these systemic challenges that we've talked about to, zero trust concepts. So just like with physical security, these layers work together to make it harder for an attacker to succeed and easier for defenders to detect and to respond. So you'll see a chart on the left-hand side of this chart. You've got sort of this challenge, and then on the right-hand side of this chart, it's kind of the mindset, the zero trust mindset that applies with respect to that challenge, right? And so we've got the first one on the left, that whole idea of assumed trust versus zero trust. So within the old model, as we've said, ICS networks assumed a trusted environment. If you're inside the plant network, you must be safe. Protocols like the ones we were just looking at, the Modbus and the IEC 104, didn't need passwords or encryption because everything was inside the fence. And the reality is that today those networks are no longer isolated. There's very few truly air-gapped systems kind of left. And zero trust is needed because it flips that assumption. Every command, user, and device must prove trustworthiness before being allowed. The second one is that low tolerance for risk. So IT systems can usually be patched, rebooted, or replaced fairly quickly. But if you reboot a substation controller, you could black out a city block, for example. And so this means that insecure systems stay online longer and attacks have bigger real-world stakes. So when you look at zero trust, it gives you compensating controls. So segmentation, MFA, and monitoring without always touching every fragile legacy device. So it's not eliminating those openings or those challenges or vulnerabilities, but it's giving you those compensating controls to balance out that risk and recognize that risk is there and just assume that risk is there. Attackers don't need advanced exploits. So because protocols are insecure, attackers don't need zero-day exploits. They just issue valid commands. As an example, the Modbus command, write single call, directly turns a pump, on or off, right? Coil. And that means that even less sophisticated actors can cause damage. What zero trust does is that it blocks misuse of valid commands. So only certain accounts at certain times can issue write operations. Number 4, interconnected systems are the same as cross-sector risk. So a cyber event in one sector, so power, for example, cascades into others, and we talked about that earlier. And that amplifies the cost of leaving insecure protocols as is. So that's even more reason not to touch anything, right? Zero trust ensures containment by segmenting rules, devices, and networks so that one compromise doesn't automatically domino across sectors. And then the last one on this table is the visibility gap. Many operators don't even know what's talking on their OT networks. Legacy devices often lack logging, as we talked about before, and insecure protocols don't authenticate who issued a command. So zero trust brings observability so that you get logs, baseline, and alerts tied to identity, not just raw traffic. And again, zero trust is it's not a product. It is a way of thinking so that you're looking to see that you have that observability. Do you have those logs and those baselines, for instance? So let's get to the roadmap. I know I spent a long time on the preamble, but it's important, I think, to make sure that we're all on the same page. Where do we start in terms of the roadmap? So when you think about all these different challenges, a lot of them depend on who you are as well and what do you have in place. And while many organizations in critical infrastructure sit below the cybersecurity poverty line, as I heard Rob Lee call it recently, it still means that there are many different challenges that organizations need to look at on their own to define their own roadmap. So I'd say that this next piece is going to be kind of the roadmap to define a roadmap. I do rely quite a bit on the SANS white paper that you can go and get. If you haven't read it, I would recommend having a look at it in the top left-hand corner there. But there are a number of other things that we structured this roadmap approach on by building on what else is out there. So I've listed a number of different resources here. So NIST 800-207 and the CISA Zero Trust maturity model define the zero trust mindset and pillars. There are a lot of things to work from, but I wanted to see if I could give you guys some clear, actionable kind of things to do. But this forms the foundation of the approach that we're going to look at today. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. What we've done is we've adapted them to a layered approach and a practical sequencing that critical infrastructure defenders can apply step by step. Okay. So these are the 10 layers that I mentioned. Different organizations, like all the ones that you saw on the previous slide, might describe zero trust in different ways. NIST and CISA use 5 pillars, for example. Industry frameworks use 3 to 6 domains. For this session, I've expanded those into 10 practical layers. That way we can map them directly to the challenges and attack paths that we see in critical infrastructure specifically. So I haven't, taken something that is broadly applied to IT, in every sector. I've tried to make this as specific as I can to critical infrastructure. It's the same zero trust principles, just structured in a way that makes them actionable in this context. And it's important to note that zero trust isn't the only path, but it's a wonderful, useful model because it gives us a way to think systematically about identity, segmentation, monitoring, and resilience. In critical infrastructure, we also have to layer in traditional engineering and safety controls, things that like hardwired fail-safes, process reliability, and secure protocol upgrades. And so where is Zero Trust the best framing? As I mentioned, identity and access, things like MFA, least privilege, for example. In segmentation, mapping, IT, OT zones, microsegmentation, monitoring and anomaly detection, continuous verification of behavior, and not assuming trust, so not assuming that every command coming from everywhere is okay. Resilience and recovery, assuming breach, so that you can recover fast. In these areas, Zero Trust aligns perfectly with the reality of adversary TTPs in critical infrastructure and reinforces existing ICS guidance. So where non-zero trust controls matter more, some ICS OT risks are best addressed by sector-specific engineering controls rather than a zero trust framing. So when you look at safety systems, for instance, so like hardwired fail-safes, trip relays, physical interlocks, Triton showed us that, that these matter and why. If you look at that attack, process safety and reliability engineering, designing so physical processes feel safe, even if digital commands are malicious. Protocol migration, moving from insecure protocols to secure protocols, where while you could stretch this into a zero trust kind of story, don't trust protocols, it's more of a protocol engineering update. Physical security, guards, gates, and surveillance, they're not usually, under the zero trust umbrella, but they are fundamental in critical infrastructure. And lastly, I'll mention workforce training and culture. So operator response, drills, cross-training, a human/organizational dimension that zero trust touches lightly, but SANS and IEC 62443 call out more specifically. And so the way I look at it is that zero trust is a strategic mindset that ties together the security side of the puzzle, and it complements but doesn't replace that engineering safety, operational practices that are already foundational in OT. Okay. So step one. All right. Are we excited? I think we're excited. I hope people are excited. All right. It's been a bit of a buildup, but I appreciate you staying with me, and I hope you're still with me here. So building an ICS-specific incident response plan is really critical as your step one. You won't be able to do everything, all the time, everywhere, and you probably know that. SANS is very clear that step one is not patching, it's not segmentation, it's not even monitoring, it's having that specific ICS incident response plan. Some of the advice I really liked in the report was, that organizations often make the common mistake about thinking of incident response as the final piece, so fix everything and then come up with an incident response plan, for instance. I really liked, as an engineering student, if I didn't have the time to learn and implement every single thing in the course, like don't tell anyone, I started with the end in mind, what was going to be on the exam, what was most likely to be on the exam. So when you think about scenario planning at the end, this results in all security controls and choices implemented earlier end up being misaligned with the necessities of incident response, not to mention the growing body of regulatory requirements on incident reporting not being met. So if you start with those requirements on incident reporting, again, that is a growing body of requirements. And if you start with the scenarios that you want to prevent, it's going to make things a lot more efficient for you. So if you think about Colonial Pipeline in 2021, the ransomware hit their business IT and not the OT systems. But because there wasn't a clear tested incident response playbook for ICS, the safest option was to shut down operations. And that decision rippled into fuel shortages and grounded flights. And so there are a lot of examples there where, there just wasn't, a plan in place. And so it's really important to look at, and choose carefully what scenarios you want to orient around. And, people will be exhausted if you do 100 scenarios, for instance. But SANS, in the SANS report, there's some very good guidance around picking, 2 or 3 specific ones that pose the most risk and need to be defended against. So looking at the next slide, it's about what does that tabletop exercise kind of look like? And I won't go through every step of the tabletop exercise because there are so many great resources out there. But what I did want to show you is step 5 that I've called out here. And again, there are lots of great resources. I just pulled in, a few steps from a tabletop exercise, so you know what I'm talking about in case you don't do these on a routine basis. But you're running these scenarios as a group with your internal team, and then you're thinking about, what happens next at every point, in time. And so you want to pick, 2 or 3 that are, pose the most risk, as I mentioned, but then you want to pick one that's consequence-based. That's one that has a high consequence impact that you really wouldn't want to see happen. And it might not be something that is common and is happening, already, like a Typhoon or some of the others that we're going to look at, but it's something that you specifically in your industry, you don't want to see happen. And then you map out, whether it's achievable through a cyber attack or not. And so in OT, in critical infrastructure, the so what isn't a data breach, it's the physical, safety, or societal impact that follows. And so you want to use your internal team expertise to determine how it could occur based on the current state, working backwards essentially from that blackout or that water treatment plant failure. What kind of cyber event could cause that? What is that potential attack path? And then work it out kind of that way. And then that number 5 is what I really wanted to call out in terms of, the pain points that might come up as you're going through that exercise and how zero trust countermeasures can apply. So if you're going through that exercise and you're thinking, oh, we don't actually know what devices are connected, then you want to pull in, if you remember that other slide with the 10 different layers, I've numbered them and these numbers match up with those. So that first one was ID verification and access control. And so in that case, then you're actually kind of looking at the IDs so that which implies that which devices there are and which ones are connected. And you've got that device trust and health check kind of element going. So you're looking at it on an ongoing basis as well. If the pain point number 2 comes up where you've got, the attacker pivoted from IT into OT because the network is flat, well, that's where segmentation and microsegmentation comes into play. If you've got pain point number 3, where an operator or vendor account had no MFA, so attackers logged straight in, again, very common. Then numbers 1 and 4 apply, where number 4 is application access controls. And then the next one is, they used insecure protocols to issue valid commands. And then that's number 4 and 6, and that continuous monitoring is introduced here. And then we didn't notice the intrusion until the damage was done. And that's where you're looking at integrating threat intelligence there into your monitoring. So that's just a sense of taking some of those challenges and looking at how they map to zero trust countermeasures as a bit of a deeper dive. Okay, step 2, and it's a 5-step process. So the step 2 is around mapping risk to defensible architecture. So once you've run your scenarios, then the next step is to map those risks to a defensible architecture. Why? Because most of our OT networks were never designed with adversaries in mind. They were built for uptime and safety, as I'd mentioned before. And in transformation, it's not, it's always important not just to look at what's there, but where things came from. And why they are the way they are. So over time, complex systems in critical infrastructure have been built as a result of a multitude of needs and not like a one size, fits all. And so going to a defensible architecture means looking at the choke points in your scenarios exposed. So the vendor VPN or the IT/OT boundary, the engineering workstation, and building segmentation, monitoring, and controls at those points. So you're overlaying the scenario maybe, and then thinking about, well, where are those choke points? Because you won't be able to patch every vulnerability in OT, but you can design your environment so that when something goes wrong, the blast radius is limited. That's the difference between one compromised vendor account and an attacker taking down an entire plant. And so in other words, this is where zero trust becomes real in critical infrastructure. You never trust the network by default. You verify at every boundary and design the system so that it can withstand attacks. And then the way you do this, again, is taking that scenario and then overlaying your current network map and just asking those questions and then looking at those choke points and then moving through and then testing the design against your threat scenario. So if you imagine your threat actor walking through your architecture, where would they get stopped? And if they wouldn't, then you found your next design priority. And so in order to make it easier to imagine that attacker, what I've done is I've created personas around them. And this is something that you can do as well based on an analysis of the threat actors that have already got impacts and we've already got data about. So this one is based on Volt Typhoon, and it's the idea of, the sleeper agent. So I've called them the sleeper agent as a generic name, but it's based on Volt Typhoon. And so we know that they are a PRC state-sponsored infiltrator, long dwell times, and their goal is to pre-position inside critical infrastructure networks for future disruption. Their personality is that they're patient, and they're stealthy and disciplined. And they've got preferred entry points as well. They like living off the land. They like stolen credentials and weak identity, remote access services, and poor segmentation are some of the things they like. So if you've ever worked in, user experience design like I have, and you would create a persona like this about a user, for instance, and then you think about how to improve the experience on your website so that you can get that user through to click, purchase on their shopping cart, or to order food on Uber Eats, or, to do whatever it is that you want that user to do. In this case, we're using kind of a persona to stop a user, essentially. If you think about the threat actor as a user, we actually want to increase the friction as opposed to decrease the friction, which is normally, what UX is used for. So this is kind of the flip side of that. And by modeling it in this way, in a way that is easy for people to take in and understand and refer to, that allows you to work better with teams across the organization. It allows, executives to understand better, what you're defending against and why the priorities are why they are, even though they may not have firsthand experience with with defense and with monitoring and all these things that you're trying to do. They can identify more with the problem when they can see it kind of as a persona. And so it's just a tool really to capture some data that we have and to test against the network design that we have, or the architecture design that we've created. And so on the right hand side, I've defined kind of the attack path, and this is just based on commonly available information about Volt Typhoon that we know now. So we know like it goes from initial access to footholds, living off the land, et cetera, lateral movement, all of those things. And then you can take zero trust principles, like those 10 items that I identified earlier, and you can map them and test them, and to think, okay, well, once we've gotten to, if they're in there living off the land, because we're assuming that they're already there because this is zero trust and we assume breach, then, have we got app access controls? Have we got continuous monitoring and analytics? How would that, stop them or not at that point in time? And then run through a test that way. So I did want to show that to you, and I've done that a few times. We won't have time to go into all the details of exactly how those zero trust countermeasures help to stop the sleeper agent at each of these points. But I am happy to speak to you, afterwards if you want to reach out to me to run through any of these, or to look at, what else we could do to apply this kind of a tool to make communication and understanding and to improve easier and to improve the effectiveness of your ability to work together with the rest of your organization. Step 3 is around establishing network visibility and monitoring. So most OT networks are still operating blind. Operators know the process, but they don't know every device or data flow on the network, and attackers exploit that. So monitoring in OT is not like IT. You can't just install antivirus and call it a day, as many of you already know. You need protocol-aware monitoring, tools that understand Modbus, DNP3, and those other protocols, and that let you baseline what's normal and then flag what's not. And that's really important because of how long these threat actors will sit on devices as well, and in your networks as well. So in Ukraine in 2016, attackers used IEC 104 to send malicious breaker commands. If monitoring had been in place, operators might have seen these commands before the blackout. Cyber Avengers exposed PLCs at water utilities. Visibility would have shown them, hanging out on the internet. So this is where zero trust principle of verify continuously comes alive. With visibility and monitoring, you finally stop operating blind. and you gain the chance to catch the sleeper agent, the loud intruder, or even the saboteur before real damage is done. And those are other personas that I've defined. So here's the saboteur. I really like the picture of this guy because he looks really excited to sabotage us. It's the perfect test of whether your monitoring works. They aren't noisy like the loud intruder, another persona I've used, but they manipulate control systems in ways that look normal on the surface. So if you don't have visibility into OT protocols, you'll only discover them after the damage is done. With monitoring, though, you can catch abnormal logic, uploads, commands issued at odd times, or safety systems behaving outside their baseline. And so, I won't have time to walk through every step of looking at it, but, the objective of the saboteur isn't just disruption. It's to cause physical damage by turning systems, against themselves. They're undermining safety, trust, and resilience of critical infrastructure. They're kind of like the ruthless engineer with malicious intent. And so, again, it's important to know that it's possible to map zero trust countermeasures against this if this is one of the scenarios that will make sense for your organization. Okay, so I'm going to go on to step number 4 of 5, and this one is about securing remote access. And we've talked about this already. I mean, this is one of the most common and dangerous weak points in critical infrastructure. If you think about it, contractors, vendors, even operators need remote access to perform maintenance or monitoring. And, sometimes even more so if you've become more remote since COVID, for example. These connections are essential, but they're also high-value targets. And we've seen time and time again, Colonial Pipeline, cyber vendors, attackers don't need sophisticated exploits. They just log in through weak VPNs or default passwords. And once they're in, they're effectively operating as trusted users. And so the fix is straightforward in principle, but it's challenging in practice. So, you first need to inventory every remote path and then enforce strong authentication on every account, route all remote sessions through controlled jump hosts in the DMZ, grant access just in time and monitor or record those sessions, and never leave vendor connections is always on. And so that's zero trust in action, never trusting a remote connection by default, always verify identity, device, and session. And if you get this step right, you close off one of the most common exploited doors into critical infrastructure. Okay, I'm going to move on. And this is the loud intruder. And again, this is another one that you can use to test, that step number 4 that we just talked about, those remote connections. And the loud intruder is going to make as much noise as possible. He's got wings. He's making a lot of noise. He's causing immediate visible disruption and generating fear. And this is another one of the possible motivations of an attacker. And this has happened. Again, this is based on information that is out there now that we know. And so it's unlike the other attackers that we've looked at so far. And it's also possible, when you do your own kind of persona or attack path, to look at, multiple attack paths and what happens along those attack paths as well. And everyone needs to collaborate to share that data. And you can share these scenarios as well to look at how it impacts others. And so number 5, the last stage in the roadmap that we'll look at is really around that risk-based vulnerability management. And the reality is in IT, we're used to patching fast and often, and in OT, it's not that simple. Patching a PLC or SCADA server can stop production or even put safety at risk, which is why there's not a lot of pen testing that's done directly on these controls. And so we can't just say patch everything. Instead, we've got to prioritize based on risk. And so which assets matter most to our mission? Which are the crown jewels? Which vulnerabilities are known to be exploited in the wild? And how do we map these to the scenarios we already identified, in step 1? Maybe you can't patch that legacy system, but you can compensate. You can put it behind segmentation. You can restrict who can talk to it, and you can monitor it for abnormal commands. And so this step is about being smart with limited resources. Attackers don't need 0 days. As we had said, they love using old, unpatched bugs. And by focusing on the vulnerabilities that matter the most to your environment and layering in zero trust defenses where patching is impossible, you dramatically reduce those options. And so the next slide is really, it's the Extortionist, which I was going to use to describe this. And again, feel free to reach out to me, and I can share some of this with you, or you can suggest, ways to improve how we look at the representation of this and strengths and weaknesses of it. Would love to hear. And there is a prioritization example as well, just to show really, if you've got everyone's got options, right? Everyone's got a long list of more things than they can actually do, right? So if we've got scenario A, where we've got an unpatched VPN gateway that's used by contractors for remote access, and then we've got another issue where we've got a pump controller that's in a treatment plant that runs, a legacy, firmware version. If we step through looking at the vulnerability, what's the impact? So what happens if it's ignored? And then look at, that outcome, and what would it take in order to improve that, and then come out with a decision. And if we capture these and record them systematically also, then it helps with, making better future decisions and always, ensuring that, well, we made this decision last time and maybe it wasn't the best decision. Or, here's our list of priorities. We've gotten through 5 of them, like great work, everyone, right? It gives you something that gives you more visibility and more effectiveness with respect to prioritization and decision making. And it is possible to do this and to get to this, and then to ensure that it's also reflected in your incident response plan. Okay, so almost at the end here, we're analyzing the villain's attack path. Again, I just wanted to reiterate that this approach is very sort of accessible. You can absolutely, use this technique to make it easier to understand, well, what are we talking about? Because often in this area, it's everybody's talking about, a lot of different things and a lot of different possibilities. And what is it that we agree on is, what we want to protect against? What is it that we are most worried about? What is it that we can do, and how do we want to action that? And how effective is it going to be? Takes it far beyond the level of just, conversations and concerns and panic, and makes it more concrete and shareable, which is so important to have those great conversations and to take action. Okay, there are a few more pitfalls, of course, siloed teams, at the human level, no governance or policy, process gaps that might occur, and everyone has them. It's okay. Everyone has them. Just figure out what they are and work towards them. And then that UX friction. So user experience friction, the operator workarounds. So in any imperfect system, there are always going to be workarounds that people use. How do you create a space where there's an amnesty for people to come forward and say, okay, this didn't work, so this is what I'm doing instead. And I'm not a bad person and I don't deserve to be fired. This is just the way things are, and this is how we get things done today. And how can we improve that? So zero trust mindset for critical infrastructure isn't just about the technology. As I said, it's the mindset. We assume compromise, we verify continuously, and we design to limit the blast radius. We don't just try to prevent every incident. We plan to detect, respond, and keep operating when one happens. And at the center of all of this is communication. As I was just highlighting, IT, OT, and leadership can't operate in silos. If that is the only thing you take away from this presentation, think about ways to bridge that. If you don't bring people together from the start, the best architecture or tools are not going to save you. The journey to zero trust is a shared one, and if we get it right, we make critical infrastructure not just harder to break, but faster to recover. I want to thank you for having me on. Again, Amy Yee. Wired for Change is a podcast that I started to help with change and to help people who are trying to drive change in order to have an impact on society specifically. And it is about the world around us that's changing so quickly, and how do we manage that and get ahead of it and make the world a better place. So reach out to me on LinkedIn. Or check out the podcast. You can watch it. It's a video podcast on YouTube, or find me on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Amazon Music. And let's work together. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Amy. Great job with the presentation. First off, though, I have to give you some arbitrary points. Your background is awesome. I know it's real. But seriously, I record a lot of people doing a lot of different things, and yours is awesome looking. I know it's from your podcast, so you kind of cheated on that one, but I'm giving you 100 points on that one. And your slides, oh my God, your slides are beautifully done. I love the color, even of the bad guys. They look like stickers you would go to RSA or Black Hat and go collect. So well done, honestly.
I should make stickers.
I think you make stickers. They're awesome looking. I mean, they're bad guys, but don't let the bad guy in, right? So I love those. I've got a couple of quick questions for you, if you don't mind. We're almost out of time, but I wanted to just a couple of quick ones. Some of the folks in critical infrastructure, they're not the biggest of places, right? They can be kind of a small operation. A lot of them don't have a lot of money either, which is odd to me, but it happens. But when you run across business leaders, maybe they're not as savvy with technology and stuff. How do you get people to understand this zero trust theory when they really don't have a good technical background?
Yeah, I think that's super important. And it's really one of the reasons why I started the podcast, because I find that executives are really challenged in that area and they don't necessarily want to admit it either. And I was one of those executives for a long time as well. And so, showing, getting people to come in and talk directly and creating safe spaces for, executives, to learn, bringing in, people are very willing to speak, even, for free to help, with something like critical infrastructure. Doing, workshops in a way that is very, kind of, again, safe and engaging, creating materials like those personas to help people understand, what people are up against. I think regular education sessions like they do for boards is a good thing, as well. And again, I think that there is, a good amount of material out there if you're aware of it or belong to a community of people who is willing to share and bring in, speakers or have, safe kind of dinners or lunches with your executive team so that they can feel okay about asking questions and understanding some of this better. Tabletop exercises can work really well for executive teams, but if they, depending on how open they are to learning kind of in the moment, it might make them feel more comfortable if they're prepared in some way in advance.
Appreciate that. Thank you. What would you say are some of the most common misconceptions that you've encountered when you're discussing zero trust, particularly when it is around critical infrastructure?
I think just the one about, how it's not the same as IT. And even, I discovered, when coming from, I think most people are coming from an IT kind of perspective when they get, when they're into cybersecurity, right? And I think that learning how the priorities, are different and how real those priorities are is, something that can be a surprise to people. Even having worked in healthcare myself, like just the reality of, a patient system being down, it sounds bad, from the outside, but when you're inside and something like that is happening, the reality of it is so different from, within another sector. So I think that understanding the priorities and how those priorities dictate, actions and plans is one of the critical things to talk about.
Appreciate it. Great job, Amy. That's the end of our time together with Amy Yee, but I have the feeling that she's going to be back at some of these other virtual conferences that we're planning for the rest of the year. I just, maybe because I organized them, I have some insight there, but I know she's going to be back. So
I will not confirm nor deny, Tom.
But so, I thought you did a wonderful job. Really great. Reach out if you're struggling with this. I heard her say she's willing to help you. So
absolutely.
There's a shortage of helpful people in the world today. I know this. Reach out and see if she can help you if you're struggling with this stuff. That's it for our time with Amy. We've got a break. Sort of a break left for you guys. And then more sessions on the way. So take a quick break and then come back, check the agenda. We should have 3 more sessions on the agenda for you. But yeah, we'll see everybody at the next round of sessions. Thanks again, Amy.
Bye. Thank you.